Hey y'all, Myra the Paranormal Chick here. Today I'm going to talk about Jacob Swenson and his tragic story. In 1973, he and a party of 18 Boy Scouts went to an overnight camping trip out in Utah, Gooseberry Reservoir. Unfortunately, only 17 returned. This is going to be a long story, but it's well worth it. So the following recount of the events that led up to the missing of Jacob Swenson is being told by Dakota Nelson, who was Jacob's best friend. And this is the story he gave to a journalist in 2005. I do want to advise that there is no footage of Dakota, as he has refused over the years to be interviewed on camera, as well as he has fallen completely off the grid. Most likely, it's on purpose. He stated this event has haunted and destroyed his entire life. The following are Dakota's words and his recollection of what happened. Where do I even begin? Dakota stated. What I'm going to tell you is everything as it exactly happened. I've been called a liar, a killer, and every other name you can think of. But you know what? I don't really care. I know what took place that night and what I saw 20 years later. We arrived at Gooseberry Reservoir around 3 p.m. on Friday, June the 8th. It was summertime, which meant we were out of school. We were 13 years old at the time, and we had been on multiple camping trips with the Boy Scouts, so we were excited to head to Gooseberry. That and the fact that summer vacation had just started. Jake and I, as his friends and family called him, both loved fishing, and Gooseberry Reservoir had great fishing. As soon as we arrived, we set up camp and pitched our tents. We weren't more than 100 yards from the lake, so we were fairly close, which we liked, so we could easily walk to the lake to fish. Jake and I were sharing a tent, as we always did, being best friends. When we camped with the scouts, there were 2 boys to a tent, and the leader shared a tent. After we finished setting up our tent, we immediately grabbed our fishing gear and ran down to the lake. I remember that day well. The weather was perfect, and we ended up catching half a dozen fish before it got dark. When we made it back to camp around 7:30 or 8 p.m., we cooked and ate some of the fish we'd caught and saved the rest for the following day. Over the next hour or two, we all sat around the fire telling stories and laughing at each other's jokes. That was a great day until we went to sleep. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when we retired to the tent, as I didn't have a watch on me and no one cares what time it is when you're camping. I remember it was late though, and I quickly fell asleep. The next thing I remember was being awakened by Jake unzipping the tent and saying he had to pee. I quickly fell back asleep and wasn't sure how long I had been sleeping before I woke up to the cold night air hitting my face. I sat up and saw the door was still open, so I called out to Jake in the darkness. There was no answer. So I called out to him several more times, and again, no answer. At that point, I was starting to get scared, so I decided to go out of the tent and look for him. I had a shirt and shorts on, so all I needed to do was slip my shoes on and grab my flashlight. As I stepped out of the tent, I remember feeling a quiet eeriness and an unnerving feeling I was being watched. I remember chills going up and down my spine and the hairs on my body standing on end. I started scanning the area around the tent and couldn't see him. I then walked around the tent about 10 yards away and called out to him again. This time louder, but again no answer. I was starting to panic. At that point, I decided it was time to wake up the leaders and let them know. Their tent wasn't more than 20 yards away, so I walked over as fast as I could, looking behind my shoulder every step of the way. Once I woke them up and told them what was going on, they didn't waste any time jumping up and getting out of the tent. Once the leaders were out of the tent, they decided to wake everyone up to not only do a head count, but help trying to locate Jake. The leaders almost immediately started yelling out Jake's name, but like before, there was no response. The leaders gathered us in a circle and explained that we were going to form a line and make a sweeping circle, gridding the area looking for Jake. They instructed us not to get more than 10 yards apart and make sure each person had a flashlight. We then formed a long line and started walking slowly in a big circle as everyone yelled out Jake's name. Every few minutes or so, we'd stop walking and yelling to see if Jake would respond back, and again, nothing. I wasn't sure how long we had been searching when one of the other boys yelled out, "Hey, I found something. Get over here." I'll never forget the horror in his voice. Everyone immediately ran to his position and looked down to where he was pointing. There on the ground was a small pool of blood. A minute went by without anyone saying anything. One of the leaders spoke first and said, "This had to be the work of either a mountain lion or a bear." One of the leaders then said, "It's not safe to continue searching in the dark." The leaders called it a night. The plan was to wake up early, drive into town, get the sheriff, and search and rescue. Before going back to sleep, though, we all pulled our tents close together in a circle. I doubt anyone slept a wink that night. As soon as it was light enough, everyone quickly piled into the cars and we drove down to the nearest town, which was Fairview. We went straight to the sheriff's station and told them what happened. A search and rescue party was quickly formed and we all left heading back to camp so we could help in the search for Jake. They even rounded up some hounds so they could try and track Jake's scent. We made it back to camp about 2 hours later. When we got out of the car, the sheriff took me aside with one of his deputies and had me show and explain everything that took place the day before, starting from when we first arrived at Gooseberry. We then showed the sheriff, his deputies, and the search and rescue party along with the hounds where we had found the small pool of blood. I vividly remember the hound standing there sniffing the blood in the ground around it, then suddenly taking off. We all took off following the hounds as everyone was yelling Jake's name as the hounds led us through the thick forest of pine trees and aspens. We must have gone several miles through the thick forest, several ravines, and over some steep mountains before finally coming to a river that was high and fast moving. Unfortunately, there was no way anyone could cross it safely. It was there the dogs lost Jake's scent. The sheriff then called everyone into a circle and said they're going to bring up horses so they can widen the search and move faster. He instructed the scouts and the leaders to head back to camp, but to stick around until they said we could leave. It took us a while to make it all the way back to camp. As we made our way out of the thick forest and our camp came into view, we could see just how many more people had arrived. A news van had even arrived and they started running up to us as we approached the camp. Our leaders were quick to get in front of us so they couldn't bombard us kids with questions. One of the main leaders of our scout troop decided to talk to the news reporter and simply give them the facts of what happened. As one of the leaders was talking to the news, the other leaders moved us away from them and over to a more secluded area so we could be alone. The rest of the day was pretty much a haze and it seemed surreal. I remember people scurrying around camp all day, but I vividly remember Jake's parents coming up later in the day. They were distraught and asked me a lot of questions, mostly about the events that unfolded and where I thought Jake might be. All I could do was repeat everything I had said many times that day, and I don't know, because I truly didn't know where my best friend was. I would have given anything to bring him back. I felt despair and emptiness that day and wondered what I could have done differently that night. I blamed myself for many years after that, until I realized I was just a kid and there was nothing more that I could have done. They searched for Jake for several weeks after that, but were never able to turn up anything. The search was eventually called off, and Jake was forever declared missing, his parents refusing to declare him dead. It's directly from Dakota Nelson. It's strange, but these are his words and what he truly believes, what happened, and what he experienced. Dakota said, "The strangest and most unbelievable part of this story took place just 20 years after Jake disappeared. I don't talk about it much, as most people don't believe me. But again, I don't care. I was there. They were not. I'd been back to Gooseberry Reservoir several times after Jake disappeared to go fishing, but mostly to remember my best friend. The summer of 1995 was the last time I ever went back, and I'll never go back again. It was the last weekend of May, which meant there was still snow on the peaks of the mountains and the water was cold. This also meant there weren't a lot of people around. In fact, I don't recall anyone else being there that day. I always went back to the exact spot where Jake and I caught all those fish the day he disappeared. I arrived early in the morning around 6:30 a.m. Fishing is always better in the early morning. I unloaded my fishing gear, put some bait on my line, and casted it out. I always brought a camping chair when I went fishing, so I set it up and plopped down in the chair and started drinking my coffee. I'm not sure how much time went by, but it wasn't long. I remember, though, I was about to take a sip of coffee when I heard from behind me, "Hello, Dakota." I immediately froze because, to my knowledge, there was no one around yet. I slowly stood up and turned around, and about 30 yards behind me stood a man I didn't recognize. He was extremely hairy from head to toe. He wasn't wearing shoes and had worn, tattered clothes on. I stood there for a bit, not able to speak. When I finally did speak, I said, "Who are you?" He stood there looking at me and finally replied, "It's me, Dakota. It's Jake." I remember a shot of horror and adrenaline immediately flowing through my body. I stood there frozen, unable to move a muscle. When I could muster up the words to speak, I said, "Where have you been all these years?" Jake's next words will haunt me until the day I die, and I think about them almost daily. I'll never forget, he said, "I was taken, and you must leave now. They're watching you. Leave now." After that, I didn't even think. As quick as I could, I loaded up my gear, threw it in the back of my truck, jumped in, started the engine, and left as fast as I could. I looked in my rearview mirror as I drove away and saw Jake slowly walking back towards the trees. As I drove towards town, I was torn. Should I tell anyone? Because who the hell would believe me, right? I wasn't sure about what happened. Was it real? It just seemed too surreal to me. I didn't tell a single soul for several years after it happened for two reasons. Number one, I knew no one would believe me. And number two, I did not want to go back there. If I told the authorities, they'd make me go back with them or think I was crazy. But the other reason, it was Jake's parents. They were old and had come to terms with his disappearance. I couldn't stomach giving them hope and having them go through it all over again. I decided to wait until they passed. That's all I have to say about my best friend Jake. I've never been back and never will. I don't know who they are or who he was referring to. But like I said, I think about it every day of my life. Thank you for listening. Jacob Swenson was never found and is still declared as missing. Dakota Nelson's story has never been validated. It's truly his word. I will leave it up to you to decide if they could be what we reference as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wild Man, the Hairy Man, the Wild Ones. We'll never know.